Hey guys, tonight the echo of the crash. Transitioning from the liberation of the roaring 20s to the sudden frugality of 1930. The silk fringe of Evelyn's flapper dress did not stop swaying just because the ticker tape had stopped printing. It was late October 1929. The air in Manhattan still carried the fadding, bitter scent of expensive gin and illegal optimism. But by the winter of 1930, the rhythm of the city had changed permanently. The frantic, syncopated heartbeat of the jazz age had slowed to a heavy, rhythmic trudge. For Evelyn, a woman who had spent her 20s dancing on the tables of speakeasies and typing at the speed of light for a midtown brokerage, the sudden silence was the most terrifying part of the collapse. The transition was not a sudden cliff. It was a slow, agonizing slide into the gray. In 1928, Evelyn had been the quintessential new woman. She had her own apartment, a tiny, sun-drenched sanctuary on 22nd Street, and a bobbed haircut that cost more than her mother's monthly groceries back in Ohio. She was independent. She was beholden to no man. She was the master of her own typewriter and her own destiny. But as the calendar turned to 1930, that hard-won independence began to feel less like a victory and more like a heavy, suffocating weight. The first sign of the new frugality was the heat, or rather, the hollow lack of it. Evelyn sat at her small, chipped vanity, staring at the glass jars of French cold cream that were now more than half empty. She knew, with a sinking, cold certainty in her chest, that they would be her last. There would be no more luxury imports from Paris. There would be no more extravagant weekends at the Hamptons. She picked up a heavy, scratchy wool shawl, a garment she would have laughed at 2 years ago, and wrapped it tightly over her slender shoulders. The radiator gave a pathetic, metallic wheeze. It was a ghost of the warmth it used to provide, mocking her with its rhythmic clanking. Frugality, she whispered to her reflection, her voice trembling slightly in the dim light, is just a polite word for fear. Her morning routine, once a celebration of modern womanhood, had become a series of desperate, strategic calculations. In 1927, breakfast was a quick coffee and a buttery pastry at a bustling, noisy cafe. In 1930, breakfast was a single slice of day-old bread, carefully toasted over a candle flame to save on the gas bill, and a cup of stretched coffee that was mostly chicory and bitter hope. She stepped out onto the street, pulling her cloche hat low over her eyes. The New York streets were different now. The very air felt thinner. The men who used to whistle at her silk stockings were now standing on street corners with hollow eyes and slumped shoulders, selling bruised apples for 5 cents. The vibrant, electric neon glow of the theaters seemed dimmed, not by a lack of electricity, but by the collective, crushing exhaustion of the crowds. Evelyn walked toward the secretarial pool where she worked, her heels clicking a lonely rhythm on the pavement. Every block felt longer than it used to. She passed the grand windows of Lord & Taylor, where the mannequins still wore the latest Paris fashions, long, elegant hemlines that signaled the end of the short-skirted flapper era. Fashion, it seemed, had grown somber and heavy to match the failing economy. At the office, the atmosphere was a thick, suffocating fog of anxiety. The new woman of the 20s was now under direct fire. Married men in the office looked at the single women with open resentment. The prevailing narrative in the newspapers was shifting. Why should a single girl have a job, they whispered near the water cooler, when a father of 4 is starving in a breadline? Evelyn kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the white paper. Her fingers flew over the keys, click a frantic, mechanical prayer for relevance. She made sure her collar was bleached bone white, and her shoes were polished with soot to hide the scuffs in the leather. In 1930, looking the part was the only armor a single woman had left. If you looked poor, you were considered unreliable. If you were unreliable, you were fired. And if you were fired, you simply disappeared into the shadows of the breadlines. Lunch was no longer a social affair. She would sit at her desk, peeling a single hard-boiled egg she had boiled the night before to save on cafeteria costs. She watched as her colleagues, girls who used to gossip about jazz clubs and boyfriends, now sat in grim silence, calculating their rent in the margins of their shorthand pads. The camaraderie of the 1920s had been replaced by a quiet, desperate competition. Every mistake on a memo felt like a potential death sentence for one's career. The evenings were the hardest part of this new, lonely life. The liberation she had prized so highly in 1925 now felt like total isolation. Without a husband or a family nearby, she was an island in a very cold, very deep sea. She spent her nights in the dim parlor of a local boarding house, where women gathered to share a single, tattered copy of the New York Times. They would pass the help wanted section around until the newsprint was smeared, gray, and completely illegible. "I saw a girl today," her neighbor Martha whispered one evening, her voice cracking. She was wearing a mink coat, Evelyn, a real, genuine mink, and she was standing in the bread line on 4th Avenue. She looked like a ghost waiting for a train that would never come. That was the true echo of the crash, the haunting, surreal image of 1920s luxury colliding headfirst with 1930s reality. Evelyn went back to her room and opened her ledger. It was a small, leather-bound book that used to track theater tickets, jazz club covers, and weekend trips to the shore. Now, it was a grim record of survival. She looked at the bottom line. There was no room for error. There was no room for a broken heel, a common cold, or a single moment of emotional weakness. The independence she had fought for in the 20s had become a prison of self-reliance. She remembered the nights of 1924, drinking champagne from teacups and thinking the party would never end. Now, the music had stopped and the lights were turned low. By November, even the streetlights seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Evelyn found herself walking past the pawn shops on 8th Avenue, her eyes lingering on the windows. She saw rows of engagement rings, silver cigarette cases, and beaded gowns, the discarded relics of a vanished world. It was a cemetery of dreams. She gripped her purse tighter, feeling the weight of her last $3. She would not let her dreams end up behind a glass window with a price tag on them. The transition from liberation to frugality wasn't just about money, it was about the soul. It was about the way a woman carried her head when she knew she had no safety net. It was about the silence of a cold room and the dignity of a mended glove. Yet, as she blew out her single candle that night, watching the smoke curl into the darkness, Evelyn felt a strange, new spark. It wasn't the giddy, bubbly thrill of the jazz age. It was something harder, something forged in fire, something made of iron. She was still here. She was still standing. The crash had taken her savings, her silk stockings, and her warmth, but it hadn't taken her name or her will to endure. The roaring 20s were dead and buried under the weight of 1,000 failing banks. The silent 30s had begun, and Evelyn, the single woman of Manhattan, would learn to speak a new, brutal language, the language of survival. By the spring of 1931, the luxury of a private apartment had become a memory as faded as a pressed flower in a heavy book. Evelyn stood on the limestone stoop of Mrs. Gable's residence for respectable young ladies, clutching the handles of her 2 remaining suitcases until the leather bit into her palms. The brownstone was imposing, a relic of a wealthier century, but the air around it smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. This was the new reality for the surplus woman. In a world where every penny was a soldier in the war against starvation, the boarding house was the only fortress left. Moving in was not merely a change of address, it was an entry into a rigid, invisible caste system. Rule number 1, Mrs. Gable barked, her voice sounding like gravel grinding in a tin can. She was a woman built of sharp angles and black silk, whose eyes could spot a scuffed heel or a late-night visitor from 100 yards away. No gentleman passed the parlor. Rule number 2, lights out in the common room by 9. Rule number 3, any girl caught cooking in her room will find her bags on the sidewalk before the grease cools. Do I make myself clear, Miss Thorne? Evelyn nodded, her throat dry, perfectly Mrs. Gable. Her residence was a narrow slice of a room on the 4th floor, what the landlord called a single, but what felt more like a vertical coffin. It was exactly 8 feet wide. The wallpaper was a jaundiced yellow, peeling at the corners like sunburned skin. The bed was a narrow iron cot with a mattress that dipped dangerously in the center. There was a single window that looked out onto an air shaft, a dark, brick-lined chimney that offered no view of the sky, only the muffled sounds of other women sobbing or coughing in the rooms below. The social hierarchy of the boarding house was dictated by 2 things: your job title and your proximity to the shared bathroom. At the top of the ladder were the senior typists, women like Beatrice, who had been with the same insurance firm for 15 years. They had the rooms with the best light and the first right to the bathtub on Saturday nights. At the bottom were the seamstresses and the shop girls, the ones whose fingers were perpetually stained with ink or pricked by needles. Evelyn, with her fadding brokerage secretary pedigree, sat somewhere in the middle, a precarious position that required her to maintain an air of weary dignity. Life in the boarding house was a symphony of forced intimacy. With 40 women sharing 3 bathrooms, privacy became the ultimate, extinct luxury. You learned the intimate details of a stranger's life by the sound of their footsteps or the scent of their cheap lavender water. You knew who was skipping dinner to save for a new pair of soles. You knew whose mother was sick back in Virginia by the way they clutched the morning mail. "It's the walls," Martha whispered one evening. Martha was Evelyn's neighbor, a girl from Maine who worked the glove counter at Macy's. They were sitting in the parlor, a room filled with lace doilies and the oppressive scent of lemon polish. "The walls are so thin, I can hear the girl in 4B dreaming, and lately all she dreams about is falling." Evelyn didn't laugh. She knew that dream. It was the universal dream of 1931. The dining room was where the drama of the blues truly unfolded. Dinner was served at precisely 6 o'clock, a grim parade of watery stews, grey potatoes, and bread that felt like sawdust. Under Mrs. Gable's watchful eye, the women practiced a desperate kind of etiquette. They used their silver-plated forks with trembling precision, pretending they were at a banquet rather than a communal trough. "I heard the textile mill in Jersey closed its doors today," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the clatter of spoons. She adjusted her spectacles, looking around the table like a judge. "They let go of 60 girls, all single. They said it was for the public good to give those spots to family men." A heavy silence fell over the table. Every woman there felt the phantom cold of the sidewalk. To be a single woman in a ladies-only residence was to live in a state of perpetual probation. You had to be respectable enough to stay, but lucky enough to keep the job that paid the rent. If you lost your position, you had 3 days before Mrs. Gable's kindness, which was already a thin veil, completely evaporated. The blues weren't just about the poverty, they were about the loss of the self. In her old apartment, Evelyn had been a person. Here she was a tenant. She was room 4C. Late at night, when the house was supposedly asleep, the real character of the boarding house emerged. It was the sound of a muffled typewriter, some girl desperately working on a freelance manuscript. It was the rhythmic thump-thump of a woman exercising to keep her figure, fearing that if she grew homely, she would be the first to be fired. It was the quiet, rhythmic clicking of knitting needles, women making scarves they hoped to sell on the street for a few pennies. One Tuesday, the hierarchy was shattered. A girl named Clara, a quiet, mousy thing who worked in the laundry, didn't come down for breakfast. When Mrs. Gable turned her master key, she found the room empty of Clara, but full of her belongings. Clara had simply walked out into the rain, leaving behind a single pair of broken shoes and a note that read, "I cannot afford to be respectable anymore." The news rippled through the house like a cold draft. For the rest of the day, the women avoided each other's eyes. Clara's departure was a reminder that the boarding house was not a home, it was a sieve, and they were all slowly slipping through the holes. Evelyn went up to her room and sat on the edge of her sagging cot. She looked at her reflection in the small, clouded mirror. Her face was thinner. The jazz-age glow had been replaced by a sharpened, predatory look, the look of a survivor. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small, hidden bar of Lux soap she had splurged on. She smelled it, closing her eyes, letting the scent of roses transport her back to a time when she didn't have to share a hallway with 40 strangers. "I am still Evelyn Thorne," she whispered to the yellowing wallpaper. "I am not 4C, I am not a surplus woman." She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of the air shaft, and began to mend the hem of her only work skirt. The thread was thin, and her eyes were tired, but she pushed the needle through the fabric with a fierce, stubborn grace. The boarding house was a place of cramped rooms and loud silences, but it was also a place of shared steel. As the moon rose over the Manhattan skyline, unseen from her narrow window, Evelyn realized that the blues were not a song of defeat. They were a cadence, a rhythm to keep them moving, one foot in front of the other, through the longest night of the century. The business girl ideal. By the autumn of 1932, the term business girl had become a cruel irony. In the glossy advertisements of the late 20s, she was depicted as a vibrant, independent spirit with a crisp white collar and a paycheck that allowed for theater tickets. But for Evelyn, the business girl was now a performance, a daily act of theater staged to convince the world she was not drowning. To lose the look of success was to invite the reality of failure. In the high-stakes offices of Manhattan, a frayed cuff or a tired eye was more than a fashion faux pas. It was a liability. The morning began at 5:30 a.m. in the cold dimness of the boarding house. Evelyn's first task was not breakfast, it was the veneer. She spent 30 minutes at her small mirror, using a piece of burnt matchstick to darken her eyelashes. Her actual mascara had run dry months ago. She pinched her cheeks hard to bring a flush of health to a face that had seen too much oatmeal and too little protein. The final touch was the dickie, a detachable white collar and bib that she wore over her one good wool dress. It was a masterpiece of deception. As long as the collar remained bleached and starched, the world wouldn't know that the dress beneath it was thin enough to see through. "You look like $1 million, Evelyn," Martha whispered from the doorway, her own eyes heavy with fatigue. "Even if we're both down to our last 40 cents. "Appearance is our only currency now, Martha," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "If the manager thinks we're hungry, he'll think we're desperate, and desperate girls make mistakes." She walked 20 blocks to the office to save the nickel fare. The walk was a gauntlet of temptation. She passed the diners where the smell of frying bacon felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Her stomach groaned, a low, hollow sound that she tried to stifle by tightening her belt. At the corner of 42nd Street, she stopped at a hole-in-the-wall stand. "One coffee," she said, sliding her nickel across the counter. "Black." This was the nickel coffee ritual. It wasn't about the taste, it was about the warmth. She held the thick ceramic mug in both hands, letting the steam soften the lines of her face. That one cup of bitter, watery brew had to sustain her through 8 hours of dictation and filing. It was her fuel, her medicine, and her breakfast. The office of Standard & Associates was a sea of clacking metal. 50 women sat in rows, their backs straight, their fingers dancing over the keys of their Underwoods and Remingtons. The noise was a relentless, mechanical, raw, clack, 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 ping, a symphony of 1930s industry. Evelyn sat at her station, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could feel the gaze of Mr. Henderson, the office manager, prowling the aisles like a shark in a pinstripe suit. He was looking for any sign of the slump. He wanted girls who were sharp, girls who were businesslike, girls who didn't look like they lived in boarding houses. "Miss Thorne," Henderson's voice dropped like a stone onto her desk. "This ledger needs to be completed by noon, and please, try to smile. You look a bit peaked today." "Of course, Mr. Henderson," Evelyn smiled, a practiced porcelain expression. "Just a bit of a late night with my studies." The lie tasted like the nickel coffee. She hadn't been studying. She had been mending her stockings with a needle and thread until her eyes burned. As the hours ticked by, the business girl ideal began to crumble. By 2:00 p.m., the lack of food caused a faint tremor in her hands. The letters on the page began to swim, the A's and O's blurring into a gray soup. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a single, small piece of peppermint candy. She let it dissolve slowly on her tongue, the tiny hit of sugar acting like a lifeline. The secretarial pool was a place of silent, mutual observation. The women didn't talk about their hunger, but they saw it in each other. They saw the way a girl would tighten her belt an extra notch. They saw the way someone would surreptitiously drink extra water from the cooler to feel full. There was a silent pact. "I won't notice your poverty if you don't notice mine." Around 3:30 p.m., the 3 o'clock slump hit the room. This was the most dangerous time. This was when the veneer slipped. Evelyn watched as a young girl 2 rows down, a new hire named Peggy, suddenly stopped typing. Peggy's head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. The room went deathly quiet. The only sound was the hum of the overhead fans. Mr. Henderson appeared instantly. He didn't offer a handkerchief. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply leaned over her desk and whispered something. 5 minutes later, Peggy was gone. Her typewriter sat empty, a cold, black skeletal frame. By the next morning, 100 other business girls would be lined up at the door to take that chair. Evelyn didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. She dug her heels into the floor, straightened her dicky collar, and began to type. Clack, clack, clack. She poured every ounce of her remaining energy into the rhythm. She would be the perfect machine. She would be the ideal. When the clock finally struck 5, the office emptied with a collective sigh of relief. Evelyn waited until everyone had left. She didn't want anyone to see her limp. The 20-block walk home felt like 40. The wind whipped up from the Hudson River, piercing her thin wool dress, mocking the professional image she had maintained all day. Back in the solitude of her narrow room, the performance finally ended. Evelyn unpinned her collar and hung it carefully over the chair. It had to stay clean for tomorrow. She took off her shoes and looked at the holes in the soles, stuffed with pieces of cardboard from a cereal box. She sat on her cot, the darkness of the air shaft pressing against the window. She was exhausted, she was starving, she was alone. But she reached for her vanity and picked up the burnt matchstick. She looked at her reflection, the sharp lines of her jaw, the fire in her eyes that even Henderson couldn't see. Tomorrow, she whispered to the shadows, we do it all over again. She realized then that the business girl wasn't just a costume, it was a shield. The nickel coffee and the starched collar were the tools of a soldier. She wasn't just a typist. She was a woman holding her ground in a world that wanted to erase her. As the city lights flickered outside, Evelyn Thorne closed her eyes, dreaming not of romance or riches, but of the steady, mechanical, beautiful sound of her own typewriter keeping the world at bay. Flour sacks and thimbles. By the winter of 1932, the fashion plates in vogue felt like transmissions from a distant, alien planet. In the shared parlor of the boarding house, the rustle of silk had been replaced by the scratching of heavy cotton and the rhythmic, metallic snip-snip of weary shears. For the single woman of the Depression, clothing was no longer an expression of personality, it was a tactical maneuver. To look shabby was to be seen as a failure, and in a city where thousands were vying for a single secretarial chair, failure was a luxury no one could afford. The era of making do had arrived, and its primary weapon was the thimble. Evelyn sat by the window, chasing the last gray sliver of afternoon light. On her lap lay a floral-patterned sack that had once held 24 pounds of Pillsbury's best flour. It was a strange, utilitarian gift from the decade. Companies had realized that impoverished women were sewing clothes from their packaging, so they had begun printing their sacks with colorful polka dots and delicate daisies. "It's a mockery, isn't it?" Martha remarked, looking over Evelyn's shoulder while darning a pair of stockings that were more thread than original silk. "The world collapses, and the flower companies try to cheer us up with printed calico." "It's not mockery, Martha, it's survival," Evelyn replied, her needle diving through the fabric with practiced precision. "If I can turn this sack into a blouse, I can save the $2 I would have spent at the bargain basement. That $2 is 10 days of soup." The art of upcycling was a grueling, imaginative process. First came the soaking. The heavy ink of the brand name, Pillsbury's, had to be scrubbed away with lye and elbow grease until the fabric was soft and anonymous. Then came the bleaching. Only then could the business girl begin her transformation. Evelyn's hands, once soft from the Jazz Ages lotions, were now calloused and pricked with 100 tiny scars. She was drafting a pattern from a tattered newspaper, pinning the thin sheets to the cotton. She had learned to conserve every square inch. A scrap of lace from an old slip became a collar. A set of buttons salvaged from a ruined coat became the focal point of a new bodice. This was the respectable veneer in the making. To the manager at the brokerage, Evelyn would appear in a new spring blouse. He would see the bright floral pattern and think she was stable, thriving, even. He wouldn't see the tiny, faded shadow on the inside seam where the word flower refused to completely vanish. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the parlor became a makeshift sweatshop. 6 women sat in a circle, their heads bowed in a silent, communal liturgy of repair. This was the sisterhood of the thimble. They traded secrets like spies: how to use onion skins to dye a faded skirt back to a rich brown, how to use sugar water to starch a collar until it was stiff as bone, how to rub a piece of wax over a fraying hem to keep it from unraveling for one more week. "Does anyone have any navy thread?" a voice whispered from the corner. It was Grace, a younger girl who had lost her job at the hat shop. She was trying to turn an old pair of men's trousers, left behind by a brother who had gone on the road, into a skirt. "I have half a spool," Evelyn said, passing it over, "but use it sparingly, Grace. It's the last of the good cotton." The social cost of making do was a constant, low-grade humiliation that they all agreed to ignore. They all knew that the fur on Mrs. Miller's collar was actually cat fur. They all knew the leather on Beatrice's belt was painted cardboard. But to acknowledge the deception was to break the spell. They lived in a world of beautiful lies, stitched together by hand. One evening, the tension of the veneer reached a breaking point. A girl named Clara arrived in the parlor with a silk dress, a genuine emerald green silk dress from 1928. It was torn down the middle, a jagged, weeping wound in the fabric. "I tripped on the subway stairs," Clara sobbed, her face buried in her hands. "It's my only good dress. I have an interview tomorrow at the New Deal office. I can't go looking like a beggar." The women gathered around the dress as if it were a wounded soldier. They looked at the silk, so fragile, so demanding. Silk was not like flour sacks. It did not forgive. "We can't mend it invisibly," Beatrice noted, her voice grim. "The thread will pull." "Then we don't mend it," Evelyn said, her eyes lighting up with a sudden, desperate inspiration. "We transform it." Under Evelyn's direction, the women went to work. They didn't just stitch the tier, they created a series of decorative tucks across the entire bodice, making the tier look like an intentional design element. They took a bit of black velvet from an old hat and created a contrast panel. By midnight, the dress didn't look like a mended rag, it looked like a new Parisian style. Clara looked in the mirror, her tears drying. "It looks better than it did before." "That's the secret of the 30s, Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "We aren't just fixing things, we're making them stronger." But the physical toll was undeniable. The flour sack era meant that even the skin was being repurposed. Their fingers were stained, their eyes were strained from working by candlelight, and their backs ached from the constant hunching over the needle. Late that night, back in her narrow room, Evelyn took off her shift and looked at her own body. She was thinner, her ribs were like the ridges of a washboard. She felt like the clothes she made, upcycled, stretched, and bleached until the original soul was almost gone. She picked up her thimble, a cheap tin thing that had turned her finger green. She held it up to the moonlight. It was a small, hollow crown. "We are the queens of nothing," she whispered to the empty air shaft. She thought of the women in the parlor, the seamstresses of the shadow. They were maintaining the dignity of a nation, one stitch at a time. Every time they mended a glove instead of throwing it away, they were spitting in the face of the Great Depression. Every time they turned a flour sack into a Sunday dress, they were asserting their right to exist in a world that wanted to discard them. The thimble was not a tool of submission, it was a tool of resistance. Evelyn laid out her Pillsbury blouse for the morning. She smoothed the wrinkles with her hand, imagining the warmth of the office, the clatter of the typewriters, and the lie she would tell with her appearance. She would walk into that brokerage house with her chin held high, her floral collar crisp and white. The world had crashed, the banks had failed, the gold standard was gone. But as long as she had a needle, a thread, and the iron will of a business girl, Evelyn Thorne would never be seen as poor. She would remain, at any cost, fashionably, stubbornly, and beautifully respectable. The kitchenette symphony. By the winter of 1933, the grand dining rooms of the 1920s, with their white linen cloths and five-course meals, had vanished like a dream upon waking. For the thousands of single women living in the cramped boarding houses of New York and Chicago, the kitchen was no longer a room, it was a corner. It was a singular, electric hot plate perched precariously on a wooden crate or a bedside table. This was the era of the kitchenette symphony, a daily performance of culinary survival where the instruments were a dented tin pot, a stolen fork, and a desperate imagination. To the outside world, Evelyn was a polished business girl. But within the four walls of room 4C, she was a chemist of the meager. The evening symphony began the moment she crossed the threshold of her room. The air in the boarding house was always heavy, a thick communal fog of boiled cabbage, cheap lard, and the metallic tang of the radiator. Evelyn would hang her coat carefully so as not to stress the thinning seams and turn her attention to the altar of the hot plate. It was a dangerous, flickering little device with a frayed cord that she had wrapped in black friction tape. It had one setting: slow burn. "What's on the program tonight, Evelyn?" Martha whispered from the doorway, her nose twitching at the scent of an opening onion. "Tonight is a concerto of depression soup," Evelyn replied, her voice tinged with a dry, weary humor. "A base of water, a chorus of potatoes, and a single, lonely carrot that I've been saving since Tuesday." Mastering the hot plate was an art of timing. Because there was only one burner, everything had to be cooked in a single pot. You couldn't boil pasta and simmer a sauce at the same time. You had to layer your ingredients with the precision of a bricklayer. First came the fat, a tiny sliver of salt pork or a spoonful of saved bacon grease hissing against the tin. Then the aromatics, the half onion that had to last 3 days. The sound of that sizzle was the most beautiful music Evelyn heard all day. It was the sound of agency. In a world that took everything away, her savings, her privacy, her future, this little pot was something she could control. "The secret," Evelyn told Martha, as she stirred the pot with a wooden spoon worn smooth by use, "is the stretch. You never cook for today. You cook for today, tomorrow, and the day you're too tired to stand." They watched the pot as if it were a crystal ball. The one-pot meal was the backbone of the single woman's existence. It was often a slumgullion, a thick, indeterminate stew of whatever could be scavenged. Sometimes it was city chicken, which was actually just cubes of pork or veal scraps on a stick, breaded to look like a drumstick. Sometimes, when the week was particularly lean, it was poorman's gravy, flour, water, and pepper, served over a piece of dry toast. But tonight was a luxury. Evelyn had found a butcher who sold soup bones for 3 cents. She had boiled the bone for 4 hours the night before, extracting every ounce of marrow and life. Tonight, she added the vegetables. As the steam rose, it dampened the yellowing wallpaper, creating a small, humid sanctuary in the cold room. The symphony wasn't just about the food, it was about the ritual. In the 1920s, dining was social. In the 1930s, it was an act of quiet, solitary defiance. To eat a hot meal, even if it was mostly water, was to maintain one's humanity. "I saw a girl in the communal kitchen downstairs crying over a scorched egg," Martha said, her voice dropping to a low, somber pitch. "She spent her last nickel on it. When the shell cracked and the yolk ran into the burner, she just stood there. She didn't even try to clean it. She just walked out." Evelyn stopped stirring. She knew that feeling. The kitchenette symphony was played on a high wire. One mistake, a tipped pot, a blown fuse, a spilled bag of salt, could mean the difference between a warm stomach and a night of gnawing, hollow hunger. "We don't cry over scorched eggs, Martha," Evelyn said firmly, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. "We scrape the pan and we keep going." The most difficult part of the symphony was the secrecy. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, detested the smell of cooking. She believed it lowered the moral character of the house. So the women developed a system of culinary espionage. They cooked with the windows cracked open to the freezing air shaft to vent the steam. They hid their hot plates under their beds when they heard the heavy, rhythmic thump of Mrs. Gable's orthopedic shoes in the hallway. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed against the door. Evelyn moved with the speed of a soldier. She snatched the pot off the burner, shoved the hot plate into the bottom drawer of her vanity, and threw a heavy wool blanket over the whole thing. The scent of onions and bone broth hung in the air, thick, incriminating, and delicious. "Miss Thorne," Mrs. Gable's voice was like a serrated blade. "I smell aromatics. Are you violating the house code?" Evelyn opened the door just a crack, her heart leaping in her throat. "Just a bit of liniment for my aching feet, Mrs. Gable, a very strong herbal liniment." The landlady narrowed her eyes, sniffing the air like a hound. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Then, with a grunt of disapproval, the shadow moved on. Evelyn leaned against the door, her knees trembling. She waited until the footsteps faded before retrieving her dinner. The stew was a bit cooler now. The symphony had been interrupted, but it was still theirs. They ate in silence, sitting on the edge of the iron cot. There was no table, no fine china. They used mismatched mugs and bent spoons, but as the warmth hit Evelyn's throat, she felt a surge of incredible, stubborn pride. She had outsmarted the hunger, she had outsmarted the landlady, she had created something from nothing. The Kitchenette Symphony was the true music of 1930s America. It wasn't the brassy roar of a jazz band or the soaring strings of a Hollywood movie. It was the low, steady hum of an electric coil, the soft bubble of a tin pot, and the quiet, rhythmic scrape of a spoon against a bowl. As she washed her single pot in the cold water of the hallway sink later that night, Evelyn looked at her reflection in the spotted mirror. Her eyes were tired, her hands were red from the lye soap, but her stomach was full. She had mastered the art of the one-pot meal. She had survived another day in the Great Depression, and tomorrow she would find a way to do it all over again. Displacement in the dust. By the summer of 1934, the sky over Oklahoma had turned the color of a bruised plum, and then it simply vanished. For Sarah, a 30-year-old schoolteacher who had spent her life believing in the permanence of the prairie, the black blizzards were more than a weather event. They were an eviction notice from God. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed through the cracks of her small farmhouse, carrying with it the pulverized remains of 1,000 failed dreams. When the bank finally took the land, and the dust had choked the last of the livestock, Sarah realized she was a woman with no anchor. She was single, she was penniless, and her lungs felt like they were lined with fine sandpaper. She had heard the whispers at the general store, whispers of a place called California, where the air was sweet with the scent of orange blossoms and the jobs were as plentiful as the sunshine. With nothing left but a cardboard suitcase and a fierce, quiet desperation, Sarah stepped onto the Mother Road, Route 66. The journey of a single woman in the Great Migration was a walk along a razor's edge. Unlike the families who traveled in overloaded Model T trucks, Sarah had no kin to shield her. She was a solitary traveler in a landscape that had grown predatory. Every mile was a calculation. Every interaction was a test of her intuition. The first few days were a blur of grit and exhaustion. The heat of the plains was a physical weight, a shimmering, relentless hand that pressed down on her shoulders. She spent her days hitching rides with families who had a spare inch of space on their running boards, and her nights in Hoovervilles, sprawling shantytowns of tin and scrap wood that had sprouted like fungus along the highway. "You alone, sister?" an old man asked her one evening near a campfire in Texas. He was stirring a pot of what looked like boiled leather. "I am," Sarah replied, her voice raspy from the silt. She kept her hand inside her pocket, gripping a small, sharp paring knife, the only protection she owned. "California's a long way for a woman on her own," the man muttered, shaking his head. "The road eats people like you, it swallows the weak, and it breaks the strong." "Then I'll just have to be something else," Sarah whispered to the fire, "something that can't be swallowed." The harrowing journey was defined by the loss of self. To survive the dust, Sarah had to abandon the schoolteacher persona. She traded her lace-up boots for heavy, masculine work shoes she found in a ditch. She wrapped a wet rag around her face until she looked like a ghost. She learned to sleep with one eye open and her back against a tree. By the time she reached the Arizona border, the landscape had changed from black dust to red rock, but the hunger remained the same. She lived on roadside charity, the occasional crust of bread shared by a sympathetic mother, or the windfall of a fallen fruit from a passing truck. Her reflection in the cracked mirrors of gas station restrooms was unrecognizable. Her skin was baked to a dark, leathery brown. Her eyes were sunken pits of iron will. The social stigma followed her like a shadow. In the towns she passed through, the migrant woman was seen as a plague. Storefronts bore signs that read, "No Okies, no job seekers, no vagrants." To be a single woman amongst this tide was to be doubly suspicious. The local authorities looked at her as a potential moral delinquent or a burden on the county's dwindling resources. One night near the edge of the Mojave Desert, the truck she was riding in broke an axle. The family she was with decided to abandon the vehicle and walk. Sarah, her feet blistered and bleeding, realized she couldn't keep their pace. She sat by the side of the road, watching their shadows disappear into the shimmering heat of the moonlit desert. This was the hollow point, the moment where the displacement was total. She was in the middle of a wasteland with no home behind her and no promise ahead. "Is this where it ends?" she asked the stars. The silence of the desert was her only answer. But then she felt the thimble in her pocket, the same tin thimble she had used to mend her schoolbooks back in Oklahoma. It was a small, cold reminder of who she had been. She stood up. Her legs screamed, her lungs burned, but she took a step, and then another. The crossing into California was not the triumph the brochures had promised. Instead of orange groves, she found the bum blockade, lines of police officers turning away anyone who didn't have $50 in their pocket. Sarah didn't have $50. She had 40 cents and a silver locket. She waited until nightfall and slipped through the brush, moving like a coyote through the shadows of the checkpoints. When she finally saw the lights of the San Joaquin Valley, she didn't weep. She didn't have enough water left in her body for tears. She simply stood at the crest of the hill and breathed in the air. It didn't taste like orange blossoms. It tasted like damp earth and diesel fuel. But it was air. It was life. Sarah had survived the Dust Bowl. She had crossed the desert as a woman alone, defying the bank, the wind, and the road itself. She was displaced, yes. She was broken, perhaps, but she was present. As she walked toward the distant campfires of the pickers' shacks, Sarah Thorne realized that the Great Plains had not just been left behind, they had been forged into her soul. The dust was gone, but the iron remained. Department store purgatory. By 1936, the marble floors of the great department stores on Fifth Avenue had become a stage for a very specific kind of American suffering. To the weary window shopper, the salesgirls at B. Altman or Macy's appeared like porcelain dolls, immaculate, smiling, and untouchable. But behind the polished mahogany counters and the scent of expensive French perfume lay a world of physical agony and psychological surveillance. For a single woman like Evelyn, who had temporarily lost her clerical position, the department store was not a career, it was a purgatory. It was a place where you were forced to sell a dream of luxury while your own stomach was hollow with the reality of poverty. "Posture, Miss Thorne, keep your chin parallel to the floor," the floorwalker, a man named Mr. Sterling, hissed as he glided past. Mr. Sterling was the high priest of this purgatory. He wore a carnation in his lapel and carried a pocket watch that dictated every second of their existence. "We are selling elegance, not exhaustion. If I see you leaning against that counter again, your commission will be docked before the clock strikes noon." Evelyn straightened her spine, feeling the sharp, familiar throb in her lower back. She had been standing for 7 hours without a break. In 1936, the department store code was absolute. A salesgirl was expected to be a statue of grace. You could not sit, you could not lean, you could not even cross your ankles. To do so was to look common, and in the Great Depression, common was a fireable offense. The physical toll was only half the struggle. The true purgatory was the moral code. As a single woman representing a prestigious brand, Evelyn's life outside the store was under constant scrutiny. The store employed service shoppers, undercover informants who would chat with the girls, trying to bait them into revealing unladylike behavior. If a girl was seen in a speakeasy, or if she was heard using slang, or if it was discovered she lived in a disreputable boarding house, she was dismissed without a reference. "They don't want employees, Evelyn," Martha whispered during their 10-minute relief in the basement locker room. Martha was working the hosiery counter, her fingers raw from handling fine silk all day. "They want saints who can survive on $10 a week. My feet are so swollen, I had to cut the lining out of my shoes just to put them on this morning." "The shoes are the least of it," Evelyn replied, massaging her aching calves. "It's the smiling. My face feels like a mask that's 2 sizes too small." The sales floor was a microcosm of the decade's class tension. Evelyn spent her days draping fur stoles over the shoulders of women who hadn't felt the sting of the crash, women whose husbands were still in the money. She had to speak in a soft, mid-Atlantic accent, pretending that she too understood the nuances of velvet and lace. She was a ghost in a gown, a servant in a cathedral of commerce. One afternoon, a customer, a woman dripping in diamonds and smelling of gin, accused Evelyn of insolence because a particular shade of lipstick was out of stock. "Do you know who my husband is?" the woman shrieked, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the cosmetics department. "I could have this entire floor cleared by sunset." Evelyn felt a hot, primal surge of rage. She thought of her narrow room, she thought of her one-pot meals, she thought of the miles she walked to save a nickel. But she looked at Mr. Sterling, who was already hovering nearby like a vulture. She took a breath, she swallowed her pride, and she bowed her head. "I am terribly sorry, madam," Evelyn said, her voice a cool, controlled melody. "The shipment has been delayed due to the weather. May I suggest this alternative? It's the shade Greta Garbo is said to favor." The lie worked. The woman preened, the anger vanishing into vanity. But as Evelyn wrapped the gold-cased lipstick, she felt something inside her wither. This was the cost of the single woman's survival, the systematic shredding of her ego for the price of a ham sandwich. The purgatory extended to the commute home. After 10 hours on the floor, the subway ride back to the boarding house was a blur of grey faces and tired limbs. Evelyn would stand in the crowded car, her eyes closed, still hearing the phantom chime of the cash registers, cha-ching, cha-ching, the heartbeat of a machine that consumed young women and spat out exhausted shadows. Back in room 4C, the ritual of the recovery began. She would soak her feet in a basin of cold water and Epsom salts, watching the swelling go down. She would look at her hands, hands that spent all day touching things she could never own. "Is it worth it?" she asked the silence of the room. She looked at her paycheck on the vanity. After rent, after the boarding house fee, after the appropriate work stockings she was forced to buy from the store at a discount, she had exactly $1.12 left for the week. But as she lay in the dark, Evelyn realized that the purgatory had taught her a new kind of strength. She was an actress now. She could endure the insults of the rich. She could withstand the tyranny of the floorwalker. She could master her own body's pain. She was learning to hide her fire behind a veil of politeness. The department store wanted a doll, but they were accidentally forging a soldier. Evelyn Thorne closed her eyes, the marble floors of Fifth Avenue fading from her mind. She wasn't just a salesgirl, she was a woman in waiting. And one day, she would walk across those marble floors, not as a servant, but as the master of her own life. Department store purgatory. By the year 1936, the marble floors of the great department stores on Fifth Avenue had become a stage for a very specific kind of American suffering. To the weary window shopper, the salesgirls at B. Altman or Macy's appeared like porcelain dolls, immaculate, smiling, and untouchable. But behind the polished mahogany counters and the suffocating scent of expensive French perfume lay a world of physical agony and psychological surveillance. For a single woman like Evelyn, who had temporarily lost her clerical position, the department store was not a career, it was a purgatory. It was a place where you were forced to sell a dream of luxury, while your own stomach was hollow with the reality of poverty. "Posture, Miss Thorne, keep your chin parallel to the floor," the floorwalker, a man named Mr. Sterling, hissed as he glided past her station. Mr. Sterling was the high priest of this purgatory. He wore a crisp carnation in his lapel and carried a silver pocket watch that dictated every second of their existence. "We are selling elegance, not exhaustion. If I see you leaning against that counter again, your commission will be docked before the clock strikes noon." Evelyn straightened her spine, feeling the sharp, familiar throb in her lower back like a burning needle. She had been standing for 7 hours without a single break. In 1936, the department store code was absolute. A salesgirl was expected to be a living statue of grace. You could not sit, you could not lean, you could not even cross your ankles. To do so was to look common, and in the heart of the Great Depression, common was a fireable offense. The physical toll, however, was only half the struggle. The true purgatory was the moral code. As a single woman representing a prestigious brand, Evelyn's life outside the store was under constant, invisible scrutiny. The store employed service shoppers, undercover informants who would chat with the girls, trying to bait them into revealing unladylike behavior. If a girl was seen in a speakeasy, or if she was heard using slang, or if it was discovered she lived in a disreputable boarding house, she was dismissed without a reference by Monday morning. "They don't want employees, Evelyn," Martha whispered during their frantic 10-minute relief in the damp basement locker room. Martha was working the hosiery counter, her fingers raw from handling fine silk all day. "They want saints who can survive on $10 a week. My feet are so swollen, I had to cut the lining out of my shoes just to be able to walk this morning." "The shoes are the least of it, Martha," Evelyn replied, massaging her aching calves in the dim light. "It's the smiling. My face feels like a porcelain mask that's 2 sizes too small." The sales floor was a microcosm of the decade's class tension. Evelyn spent her days draping heavy fur stoles over the shoulders of women who hadn't felt the sting of the crash, women whose husbands were still in the money. She had to speak in a soft, mid-Atlantic accent, pretending that she too understood the nuances of velvet and lace. She was a ghost in a gown, a servant in a cathedral of commerce. One afternoon, a customer, a woman dripping in diamonds and smelling faintly of gin, accused Evelyn of insolence, simply because a particular shade of Parisian lipstick was out of stock. "Do you know who my husband is?" the woman shrieked, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the cosmetics department. "I could have this entire floor cleared by sunset." Evelyn felt a hot, primal surge of rage deep in her chest. She thought of her narrow, cold room, she thought of her one-pot meals, she thought of the miles she walked to save a single nickel. But she looked at Mr. Sterling, who was already hovering nearby like a silent vulture. She took a slow breath, she swallowed her pride like a bitter pill, and she bowed her head. "I am terribly sorry, madam," Evelyn said, her voice a cool, controlled melody. "The shipment has been delayed due to the weather. May I suggest this alternative? It's the exact shade Greta Garbo is said to favor." The lie worked. The woman preened, her anger vanishing into vanity. But as Evelyn wrapped the gold-cased lipstick in silk paper, she felt something inside her wither. This was the true cost of the single woman's survival, the systematic shredding of her ego for the price of a ham sandwich. The purgatory extended to the long commute home. After 10 hours on the marble floor, the subway ride back to the boarding house was a blur of gray faces and tired limbs. Evelyn would stand in the crowded car, her eyes closed, still hearing the phantom chime of the cash registers, cha-ching, cha-ching, the heartbeat of a machine that consumed young women and spat out exhausted shadows. Back in the solitude of room 4C, the ritual of the recovery began. She would soak her feet in a chipped basin of cold water and Epsom salts, watching the swelling slowly go down. She would look at her hands, hands that spent all day touching beautiful things she could never hope to own. "Is it worth it?" she asked the heavy silence of the room. She looked at her paycheck on the vanity. After rent, after the boarding house fee, and after the appropriate work stockings she was forced to buy from the store at a discount, she had exactly $1.12 left for the entire week. But as she lay in the dark, Evelyn realized that the purgatory had taught her a new, lethal kind of strength. She was an actress now. She could endure the insults of the rich. She could withstand the tyranny of the floorwalker. She could master her own body's pain. She was learning to hide her fire behind a veil of perfect politeness. The department store wanted a doll, but they were accidentally forging a soldier. Evelyn Thorne closed her eyes, the marble floors of Fifth Avenue finally fading from her tired mind. She wasn't just a salesgirl, she was a woman in waiting. And one day, she would walk across those marble floors, not as a servant, but as the master of her own life. Sisterhood in the Breadline. Subtitle: The informal networks and mutual aid societies formed between neighbors. By 1937, the Great Depression had stripped away the illusions of individual success, leaving behind a raw, communal struggle for existence. In the heart of the city, the breadline had become a permanent fixture of the geography, a long, shivering ribbon of gray coats and hollow eyes that stretched around city blocks like a mourning band. For Evelyn, standing in these lines was a transformation. It was here, in the cold shadow of the municipal buildings, that she discovered the secret economy of women, an informal network of sisterhood that became the true safety net of 1930s America. The breadline was not merely a place of hunger, it was a marketplace of information and a sanctuary of shared burden. "Go to the mission on 10th Street today, Evelyn," whispered a woman named Rose, who was standing just ahead of her. Rose was a former music teacher whose piano had been sold 2 years prior to pay for her sister's funeral. Now her hands were perpetually tucked into her armpits to keep them from freezing. "The line is 4 blocks long, and they're only giving out day-old rye. Try the Baptist cellar on 14th. They have a new shipment of lard and maybe, just maybe, some powdered milk." Evelyn nodded, committing the information to memory. This was the currency of the sisterhood. While the men in their lines often stood in a grim, defeated silence, the women spoke in low, rapid-fire exchanges. They traded tips like high-stakes gamblers. They knew which grocer would give away bruised apples at closing time, which landlord was soft-hearted enough to wait an extra week for rent, and which pharmacies were giving out free samples of liniment. Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. This was the Mutual Aid Society of the Displaced. It had no charter, no dues, and no official name, but it kept thousands of single women from disappearing into the void. In the boarding house, this sisterhood manifested as a quiet, collective resilience. When Martha's only pair of work stockings developed a ladder that couldn't be mended, Evelyn didn't say a word. She simply left her own spare pair on Martha's pillow. A week later, when Evelyn fell ill with a fever that threatened to cost her her job, it was Martha and the others who took turns covering for her, bringing her bowls of hot water and pretending to the landlady that Evelyn was just sleeping in on her day off. "We are like the birds, Evelyn," Martha said one evening as they shared a single precious orange that a neighbor had traded for a sewing repair. "One of us finds a crumb, and we all survive another hour. If we fly alone, we fall. If we fly together, we might just make it to the spring." Voice generator, emphasize the word together. But the sisterhood had a harder edge as well. It was a network of protection. In the 1930s, a single woman on the street was prey for many things: predatory men, corrupt officials, and the soul-crushing despair that led to the quiet rooms of the tenements. The women looked out for each other. They walked in pairs to the late-night shifts. They shared codes about which street corners were safe and which were not. If a girl didn't return to the boarding house by curfew, the network went into action, whispers traveling from room to room until someone found out where she was. The breadline itself was a grueling test of this sisterhood. Standing for 4 hours in the sleet required a communal effort to maintain dignity. They would tell each other stories, not about their current misery, but about their past lives and future dreams. They talked about the movies they wanted to see, the books they were reading at the library, and the dresses they would sew once the good times returned. "I'm going to have a house with a porch," Rose said, her eyes focusing on something far beyond the brick wall of the warehouse. "And on that porch, I'll have a piano that stays in tune, and every Sunday I'll bake a cake with real butter, not margarine, not lard, butter." Evelyn watched Rose's face, seeing the light of that imaginary porch reflected in her tired eyes. She realized then that the breadline was where the spirit was fed as much as the body. The sisterhood was a refusal to let the depression take their humanity. They weren't just beggars, they were a community. They were the invisible army of the unemployed, and they were fighting a war of attrition against despair. One day, the line moved slower than usual. The rumor was that the supply had run out. A ripple of panic moved through the crowd, a cold, sharp tension that threatened to break into a riot. Evelyn felt her own heart race. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, but then she felt a hand on her arm. It was Rose. "Stay steady, Evelyn," Rose whispered, her voice like iron. "I have half a sandwich in my pocket if they run out. We split it. We don't break. We don't let them see us break." That moment defined the era for Evelyn. The sisterhood in the breadline was the realization that even in the total absence of money, there was an abundance of grace. They were single women, discarded by the economy, but they were not alone. They were the architects of a new kind of social contract, one built on a shared crust of bread and a whispered word of encouragement. As the sun began to set behind the skyscrapers, the line finally reached the door. Evelyn received her portion, a heavy loaf of bread and a small tin of soup. She walked back to the boarding house, the bread tucked under her arm like a treasure. She didn't think about her own hunger. She thought about Martha, who was coming home late from the laundry, and Rose, whose hands were still cold. The breadline was a symbol of failure for the nation, but for the women who survived it, it was a testament to a strength that the banks could never understand. They were the unbound women, and as long as they stood together, the breadline was not a dead end, it was a bridge. Evelyn climbed the stairs to room 4C, her footsteps light despite her exhaustion. The sisterhood was waiting, the pot was on the hot plate, and tonight they would all eat together. FDR's alphabet soup. By the spring of 1938, a new language had begun to echo through the hollowed-out canyons of Manhattan. It was a language of acronyms, a strange, bureaucratic poetry that the newspapers called FDR's alphabet soup. For years, the single women of America had survived on nothing but grit and shadow economies, but now the federal government was finally opening its eyes to the invisible woman. From the WPA to the NYA and the CCC, the New Deal was no longer just a headline, it was a lifeline. For Evelyn, the alphabet soup began with a tattered flyer pinned to the post office wall. WPA Women's Division, applicants wanted. The Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, was a gargantuan beast of an agency, but for a single woman in her 30s, it represented the first time the United States government had looked at her as a productive citizen rather than a social burden. It was a promise that a woman's labor had value, even if she didn't have a husband's name on her tax forms. "It's real, Martha," Evelyn said, her voice trembling as she stood in a line that stretched 3 blocks around the federal building. "They aren't just giving out soup this time, they're giving out purpose." Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The transition from the department store purgatory to the WPA was like stepping from a tomb into a workshop. Evelyn was assigned to a sewing and literacy project in a converted warehouse on the west side. The air was thick with the scent of industrial oil and fresh cotton, but unlike the boarding house, this space hummed with a different kind of energy. This was alphabet soup in action. The impact was immediate and profound. Under the WPA, single women were organized into sewing rooms that produced millions of garments for the needy, but they weren't just seamstresses, they were being trained. Rule number 1 of the New Deal, the supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Roosevelt, no relation to the president, though she shared his fire, announced to the hall, "We do not just produce coats, we produce skills. If you can sew a straight line today, you will learn to manage a production floor tomorrow. If you can read a blueprint, you can build a nation." Evelyn found herself in the clerical division of the project. Here, the business girl ideal was finally being put to a noble use. She wasn't typing memos about stock dividends for wealthy brokers. She was cataloging historical records, indexing public library collections, and helping to organize the Federal Writers Project. The Alphabet Soup programs were specifically designed to address the unique plight of the unmarried woman. The government realized that without a male breadwinner, these women were the most vulnerable to the cycles of the Depression. The New Deal provided professional and service projects that allowed artists, teachers, and nurses to maintain their dignity. Evelyn's friend, Rose, the former music teacher from the breadline, was hired by the Federal Music Project. For the first time in years, Rose wasn't standing in the sleet. She was teaching piano to tenement children in the Bronx, her salary paid by a government that believed music was as essential as bread. "It's the first time I've felt like a person since 29, Evelyn," Rose whispered as they sat in a park, eating lunches bought with WPA dollars. "I'm not a charity case anymore, I'm a public servant." Voice generator emphasized the word servant. However, the alphabet soup was not without its bitter ingredients. The New Deal was a battlefield of gender politics. Many in Congress argued that every job given to a single woman was a job stolen from a family man. The pay for women in the WPA was often lower than that of their male counterparts, and the single woman was always the first to be cut when the budgets tightened. "They give us the soup," Martha remarked cynically one evening, "but they keep the silver spoons for themselves. They expect us to be grateful for 75 cents on the dollar." It's not just about the scents, Martha, Evelyn countered, her eyes fixed on the new post office mural being painted by another WPA artist. It's about the fact that we are on the payroll at all. We are part of the alphabet. We are no longer the extras. Pause for voice generator, 1 second. The WPA and its sister agencies, like the Social Security Act of 1935, began to change the long-term architecture of a single woman's life. For the first time, Evelyn saw a future where she wouldn't have to rely on the sisterhood or a pawn shop when she grew too old to type. The alphabet soup was creating a safety net that was woven into the law of the land. The social impact was even more subtle. By gathering thousands of single women together in these work projects, the government was accidentally creating a powerful political consciousness. In the sewing rooms and clerical pools, women talked. They talked about labor rights. They talked about the right to vote. They talked about the minimum wage and the maximum hour. The New Deal was the forge where the modern American working woman was being hammered into shape. One afternoon, a photographer from the Farm Security Administration, another letter in the soup, the FSA came to the warehouse. He asked Evelyn to sit for a portrait. He wanted to capture the face of the New Deal woman. Evelyn sat straight. She did not pinch her cheeks or try to look marriageable. She looked into the camera with the steady iron gaze of someone who had survived the echo of the crash, the dust, and the boarding house. She wore her WPA badge like a medal of valor. "That's it," the photographer murmured. "That's the look of a woman who isn't waiting for the storm to pass. She's learning how to work in the rain." As the decade drew to a close, the alphabet soup programs began to wind down as the gears of the war machine started to turn. But the impact was indelible. Evelyn Thorne was no longer the girl who drank nickel coffee and hid from her landlady. She was a woman who had seen her government recognize her worth. FDR's programs hadn't just fixed the roads and the bridges, they had repaired the broken spirit of the American bachelor girl. They had given her a seat at the table, and even if the soup was thin, the bowl was hers. The silver screen, escape. By 1938, the Great Depression had become a weary, familiar ghost that followed every single woman through the slushy streets of New York. But there was one place where the ghost could not enter. It was a palace of velvet and neon, a cathedral of light known as the movie house. For Evelyn and thousands like her, the cinema was not merely entertainment, it was a biological necessity. It was the only place in America where, for the price of a single dime, a girl could stop being a surplus woman and become, for 2 hours, a creature of starlight and silk. The escape began long before the projector flickered to life. It began with the penny discipline. To afford a Saturday matinee, Evelyn had to practice a brutal kind of arithmetic. It meant skipping 2 evening meals of toast and tea. It meant walking an extra 10 miles to save a week's worth of subway fares. It meant ignoring the hollow, gnawing ache in her midsection in exchange for a ticket to a dream. "Is it worth the hunger, Evelyn?" Martha asked one Friday night, watching Evelyn carefully count 10 copper pennies onto her dresser. "The hunger is always there, Martha," Evelyn replied, her eyes fixed on the coins. "But the darkness doesn't have to be. Tomorrow, I'm not going to be a typist with a frayed collar. I'm going to be in a penthouse in Park Avenue. I'm going to watch Ginger Rogers dance until the world stops spinning." Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The ritual of the Saturday matinee was a communal transformation. When Evelyn arrived at the Roxy or the Radio City Music Hall, she joined a line of women who all shared the same secret. They were there to forget. They stood in the cold, clutching their dimes, looking at the vibrant posters of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. The posters were windows into an impossible world, a world of bubbling champagne, floor-length white satin, and men who never looked at a bank statement. Stepping into the theater was like submerged in a warm bath. The scent was unmistakable, a mix of heavy floor wax, damp wool coats, and the faint, buttery ghost of popcorn that only the wealthy could afford. Evelyn found her seat in the darkened balcony. She didn't mind the height. The higher she was, the closer she felt to the screen. When the lights dimmed and the heavy velvet curtains parted, a collective sigh rippled through the audience, a soft, rhythmic exhale of 1,000 women letting go of their burdens. Voice generator, read the next part with a dreamy and flowing tone. Then the magic began. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly, the grey slush of 1938 was replaced by the shimmering black and white elegance of a ballroom. Ginger Rogers appeared, draped in ostrich feathers that seemed to defy gravity. She moved with a grace that made the very idea of exhaustion seem absurd. Every step, every twirl, every effortless laugh was a strike against the depression. Evelyn watched, her eyes wide, her fingers unconsciously mimicking the rhythm of the dance on her velvet armrest. For those 2 hours, her stomach did not growl. The cold did not bite. She wasn't thinking about the rent she owed Mrs. Gable or the WPA forms she had to file on Monday. She was Ginger. She was being swept across a polished floor by a man who didn't care about the price of coal. "Look at her shoes," a woman whispered in the row behind her. "Not a scuff on them, not a single patch." "It's not just the shoes," Evelyn thought. "It's the way she breathes, like the air is free." Pause for voice generator, 1 second. The silver screen escape was a carefully curated medicine. The movies of the 1930s, the screwball comedies, and the grand musicals were designed to be the antithesis of the street. They provided a visual vocabulary for a life that was currently out of reach. From the movies, Evelyn learned how to tilt her hat at a defiant angle. She learned the witty banter that she used to deflect the prying questions of her landlady. She learned that a woman could be sharp-tongued and still be loved. But the cinema offered more than just fashion and jokes. It offered a shared emotional language. In the dark, the bachelor girl wasn't alone. When the hero and heroine finally embraced, Evelyn could hear the soft sniffling of the women around her. It was a safe place to cry, not for the hunger, but for the beauty. It was a place where they could mourn the lives they were supposed to have had before the crash stole the music. Voice generator, read with a sorrowful but resilient tone. The most brutal part of the escape was always the exit. When the end title card appeared and the house lights flickered on, the spell didn't just break, it shattered. The audience shuffled out of the theater, their faces pale in the harsh, artificial light of the lobby. They went from the penthouse back to the pavement. Evelyn stepped out onto 50th Street. The wind hit her instantly, cutting through her thin coat like a knife. The neon lights of the theater reflected in the oily puddles on the ground. She looked down at her shoes, the same shoes with the cardboard insoles. She felt the hunger return, sharper now, as if it were angry at being ignored for 2 hours. "Back to the real world," Martha sighed, pulling her collar up. "No," Evelyn said, her voice small but firm. She adjusted her cloche hat, tilting it at the exact angle she had seen on the screen. She straightened her back and walked with a rhythmic, graceful step, even as her feet ached. "The movie isn't the lie, Martha. The misery is the lie. The movie is what we're fighting to get back to." That was the true power of the silver screen. It gave the single women of the 1930s a memory of elegance to carry into the trenches of their daily lives. It was a light that didn't go out when the projector stopped. Evelyn walked home, the music of the ballroom still humming in her mind. She would eat her dry toast tonight. She would mend her stockings by candlelight. She would endure the alphabet soup and the boarding house blues. But she would do it with the spirit of a woman who knew that somewhere, even if only on a reel of celluloid, the world was still beautiful and the dance was still going on. As she climbed the stairs to room 4C, she didn't look at the peeling wallpaper. She looked at the shadows on the wall and saw the silhouette of a gown. She had saved her pennies, she had forgotten her hunger, and for one Saturday afternoon, she had been a queen. Boxcar nomads. By the summer of 1938, the city had become a dry well for thousands of single women. The WPA rolls were full, the department stores were cutting staff, and the boarding houses were overflowing with the quietly desperate. For a woman like Evelyn, the choice had become binary: stay and starve slowly in a narrow room, or take to the iron road and risk a fast death for the chance of a future. This was the world of the boxcar nomads, the sisters of the road who shed their skirts for denim and their names for the anonymity of the freight yards. The transition from business girl to hobo was a shedding of the soul. "If you're going to ride the rails, Evelyn, you have to forget you were ever a lady," whispered Bertha, a weathered woman in her 50s who had been riding the Southern Pacific Line since the crash of '29. They were crouched in the tall, yellow grass of a rail yard in New Jersey, the midnight air smelling of creosote and cold grease. The bulls, the railroad police, don't care about your typing speed. They only care about breaking heads. And the men in the cars, well, some are brothers and some are beasts. Evelyn looked down at her clothes. She had traded her cloche hat for a battered newsboy cap. Her silk stockings were gone, replaced by heavy canvas trousers and boots stolen from a clothesline. She was no longer a secretary, she was a ghost in the machinery of American transit. Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The hop was a terrifying baptism of iron and speed. When the freight train began its slow, rhythmic crawl out of the yard, chug 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 shhh, Evelyn felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "Now," Bertha hissed. They ran. The ground was a blur of gravel and soot. Evelyn reached out, her fingers catching the cold, vibrating iron handle of an open boxcar. She swung her weight upward, her muscles screaming as she pulled herself into the cavernous, dark belly of the train. The floor was covered in a thin layer of grain dust and the lingering scent of cedar. As the train gathered speed, the city began to slide away, the skyscrapers of Manhattan becoming jagged teeth against the moonlit sky. Life as a boxcar nomad was a masterclass in invisibility. To be a woman alone on the rails was to be a target. Evelyn learned the nomad's code quickly. You never traveled under your real name. You bound your chest with strips of cloth to hide your silhouette. You smeared grease on your face to look younger, older, or simply dirtier, anything to avoid being noticed. "We are the sisters of the road," Bertha said, as the train rattled through the dark heart of Pennsylvania. "The men call it hoboing. For us, it's just moving the hunger to a different zip code." The underground geography of the rails was a language of symbols. Evelyn learned to look for hobo signs carved into fence posts near the tracks. A drawing of a cat meant a kind lady lived nearby, a triangle with hands meant the owner had a gun, and a jagged line meant the local bulls were looking for blood. The harrowing reality of the journey was the sensory overload of the boxcar. The noise was a relentless, metallic roar that made conversation impossible. The vibration turned your bones into tuning forks. In the summer, the steel cars became ovens. In the winter, they were iceboxes that turned a person's breath into frost on the walls. One night somewhere outside of Ohio, the train slowed to a crawl. The heavy sliding door of their car creaked open. A group of men, shadows with jagged voices, looked inside. "Looky here," one of them rasped, the smell of cheap moonshine wafting into the car. 2 fresh ones. Evelyn felt the cold bite of the paring knife she kept in her boot. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She stood in the corner, her newsboy cap pulled low, trying to radiate a stillness that looked like lethargy rather than fear. Bertha stepped forward, a heavy iron wrench in her hand. "Move along, boys, we're just freight, and freight don't like being touched." The men lingered, their eyes gleaming like predatory cats in the dark. Then, with a chorus of curses, they jumped back down to the gravel. The train lurched forward, and the danger receded into the night. Voice generator, read the next part with a low and trembling tone. "That's the toll," Bertha whispered, her hand shaking as she tucked the wrench away. "Every mile has a price, Evelyn. Sometimes you pay in sweat, sometimes you pay in blood." The nomadic life was a search for the Big Rock Candy Mountain, the mythical place where jobs grew on trees and the sun always shone. For Evelyn, that mountain was California, or maybe a cannery in Seattle, or a textile mill in the Carolinas. She followed the rumors. She followed the smoke. She followed the sound of the whistle. By the time the train reached the Midwest, Evelyn had lost 10 pounds. Her skin was a map of bruises and soot, but she felt a strange, terrifying liberation. She was no longer tied to a boarding house. She was no longer waiting for a man to give her a desk. She was moving. She was part of the great, shifting mass of American humanity that refused to sit still and die. "Look at the horizon, Evelyn," Bertha said, as the sun rose over a field of golden wheat. "No skyscrapers, no managers, just the road." Pause for voice generator, 1 second. The boxcar nomad was the ultimate expression of the 1930s single woman's resilience. They were the women who refused to be surplus. They took the machinery of the country and used it to find a way out. They were the sisters of the road, and their history was written in the soot of the engines and the rhythmic clanking of the wheels. As the train crossed into the vast, open plains, Evelyn Thorne looked out the open door. She was a nomad. She was a survivor. She was a woman of the Iron Road. The echo of the crash was miles behind her. The dust was beneath her wheels. She didn't know where the train would stop. She didn't know if there would be a job at the end of the line. But as the whistle shrieked into the morning air, a long, lonely, defiant cry, Evelyn realized she wasn't afraid of the destination. She had conquered the journey. The whispered choice. By the late 1930s, the Great Depression had not only hollowed out the American wallet, it had colonized the American body. For the single woman, the stakes of survival were written in the biological clock. In an era where pregnancy out of wedlock meant the immediate loss of a job, a home, and a reputation, the whispered choice was the most dangerous secret of the decade. This was the clandestine world of women's clinics, dimly lit backrooms, and unlicensed practitioners where the desperate sought a way to reclaim their futures. For Evelyn, the choice was a shadow that hung over every boarding house conversation, a silent phantom that haunted every office romance. The ritual of the whisper usually began in the communal bathrooms of the boarding house. It was a language of coded phrases and heavy glances. You didn't ask for a doctor, you asked for a friend who helps. You didn't talk about a procedure, you talked about fixing a late cycle. In 1938, reproductive health was not a right, it was a criminal conspiracy. "I saw Sarah from the 3rd floor today," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of a running faucet. "She's been late for 3 weeks. She's terrified, Evelyn. If the landlady finds out, she's on the street. If the manager finds out, she's fired. She's looking for the blue house in the village." Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The Blue House was a legend, a place where for $20 and a vow of silence, a woman could find a solution. But the price was often more than just money. It was the risk of infection, the risk of the police, and the risk of a permanent, hollow silence. Evelyn accompanied Sarah to the clinic on a cold Tuesday night. They walked in the shadows of the alleyways, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm. The clinic was actually the back of a tattered upholstery shop. The air smelled of turpentine, stale tobacco, and an overwhelming chemical scent of carbolic acid. "Don't speak unless you're spoken to," Evelyn reminded her friend, her hand gripping Sarah's trembling arm. "And remember, once we go through that door, we don't know each other." Voice generator, read the next part with a tense and somber tone. The practitioner was a man who went by the name Dr. Miller, though his hands were thick and calloused, more like a mechanic than a surgeon. He didn't ask for names, he only asked for the envelope of cash. "The law doesn't care about your hunger, girl," he grunted, the light of a single bare bulb reflecting in his spectacles. "It only cares about the morality of the poor. If you scream, the neighbors call the bulls. If you bleed, you go to the hospital and you tell them you fell down a flight of stairs. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her face the color of the chalky walls. Evelyn was forced to wait in the hallway, a narrow, airless space where the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Pause for voice generator, 1 second. This was the clandestine world that the history books often ignored. It was a world where single women had to be their own protectors. The whispered choice was a testament to the absolute vulnerability of the unmarried woman in the 1930s. Without the protection of a husband, her body was a liability. The state wanted her to be a mother, but the economy demanded she be a machine. Evelyn sat on a rickety wooden chair, hearing only the distant, muffled sounds of the street and the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the shop. She thought about the alphabet soup programs, the WPA and the FSA that provided jobs but offered no protection for this. She thought about the bachelor girl stigma that made this secrecy necessary. "We are ghosts," she thought, her eyes stinging. "We are walking through a world that uses us up, and then punishes us for being used. When the door finally opened, Sarah emerged, leaning heavily against the frame. She looked aged by 10 years. Her eyes were hollow pits of exhaustion. The procedure was over, but the choice would stay with them both forever. They walked home in a daze, the city lights feeling too bright, too loud. Every police siren sounded like a personal indictment. They avoided the main thoroughfares, slipping through the side streets like thieves. Voice generator, read with a low and haunting pace. Back at the boarding house, the sisterhood went into action. Martha had a kettle of hot water ready. Beatrice had a clean sheet and a bottle of medicinal brandy she'd bartered from a neighbor. No questions were asked. The underground economy of skills and meager supplies turned into a makeshift infirmary. "It's done," Sarah whispered as they tucked her into the iron cot. "I can go back to work on Monday. I can keep my room." "Rest now, Sarah," Evelyn said, wiping the sweat from her friend's brow. "The secret is safe. The cycle is fixed." That night, Evelyn lay in her own bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. She realized that the whispered choice was the ultimate expression of the single woman's resilience. It was a brutal, terrifying kind of agency. They were taking control of their lives in a world that allowed them none. They were the sisters of the road, the business girls, and the boxcar nomads, and they were the keepers of the most private of wars. The 1930s was a decade of public struggle, but for the single woman, it was a decade of private iron. As the sun began to rise over the Manhattan skyline, Evelyn Thorne knew that the choice was not a tragedy of morality, it was a tragedy of necessity. She closed her eyes, the scent of carbolic acid still lingering in her mind. They had survived the night, they would survive the week, and they would keep the secret until the world changed enough to let them speak. Faith and its limits. By the winter of 1938, the skyscrapers of New York felt less like monuments to progress and more like cold, indifferent headstones. For Evelyn, the only warmth that didn't cost a nickel was found behind the heavy oak doors of St. Jude. In the 1930s, the church was the final frontier of the American social fabric. It was a complex sanctuary, a place that offered a steaming bowl of soup with one hand, while holding a yardstick of moral judgment in the other. For the single woman, navigating the church was an exercise in spiritual diplomacy. To survive, you had to be pious enough to receive aid, but invisible enough to avoid the scorching glare of the pulpit. The ritual of the Sunday best had become a desperate masquerade. Evelyn would spend Saturday nights scrubbing her one good blouse and using a black ink pen to hide the white threads showing through her coat. Inside the sanctuary, the air was a thick mixture of frankincense, damp wool, and the hushed whispers of the terrified. "Look at them, Evelyn," Martha whispered as they knelt on the hard wooden benches. "They pray for our souls, but they count the buttons on our sleeves to see if we've been modest with our meager earnings." "The church is a bank, Martha," Evelyn replied softly, her eyes fixed on the flickering votive candles. "But instead of gold, they deal in respectability. If you don't have enough of it, they won't cash your plea for help." Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The social safety net provided by the church was literal. In the basement of St. Jude, the ladies' auxiliary organized clothing drives and distributed mercy bags filled with flour, salt, and occasionally a small tin of evaporated milk. For a single woman living in a boarding house, these bags were the difference between a week of strength and a week of fainting spells at the typewriter. However, the price of the mercy bag was the moral audit. To receive aid, Evelyn had to endure the questioning of Father O'Malley, a man whose heart was as large as the city, but whose theology was as rigid as a steel beam. "Miss Thorne," he would say, his voice echoing in the stone-cold rectory, "I see you are still living at Mrs. Gable's, a house of women, alone. Do you attend the evening vespers? Do you keep company with men who have no intentions of marriage?" "I keep company with hunger, Father," Evelyn thought, though she kept her expression as blank as a fresh sheet of carbon paper. "I spend my evenings in study and prayer, Father," she said aloud, her voice a practiced melody of humility. "A woman alone must be twice as careful with her light." Voice generator, Read the next part with a tense and reflective tone. This was the limit of faith. The church provided the bread, but it also provided the shame. It reinforced the idea that a single woman was a broken unit, a stray sheep that needed to be folded back into a family or a convent. In the sermons, the modern woman was often depicted as the architect of the nation's moral decay. The preacher would shout about flappers and vanity, while Evelyn sat in the third row, her stomach growling so loudly she feared the woman next to her could hear it. The church was also the judgmental overseer of the community's gossip. If a girl from the boarding house stopped attending Sunday service, the whispers began. Was she sick, or had she finally fallen? The church was the record keeper of reputations, and in 1938, a tarnished reputation was a death sentence for a woman's employment. One Sunday, a young woman named Clara, the same girl who had sought the whispered choice months earlier, fainted during the high mass. The congregants didn't rush to help her with compassion. They moved back with a collective, sharp intake of breath. The silence was not one of concern, but of suspicion. "Don't let them take her to the rectory," Evelyn whispered to Martha, moving forward to catch her friend. "If they start asking questions while she's delirious, she's lost." Evelyn and Martha carried Clara out into the biting winter air, away from the judgmental incense and the marble saints. They sat on the stone steps, the church bells tolling above them like a warning. "Pause for voice generator, 1 second. The God in there," Martha said, gesturing to the stained glass windows. "He's for the families. He's for the people with houses and names. I think the God for us. He's out here in the wind." Evelyn looked at the sky, gray and heavy with the promise of snow. She realized then that her faith had shifted. She no longer looked to the pulpit for her worth. The limits of faith had taught her that the church was a human institution, flawed, fearful, and obsessed with order. Her real sanctuary was the sisterhood, the shared crust of bread, and the iron will that kept her standing when the world told her to kneel in shame. Voice generator, read with a low and haunting pace. That night, Evelyn didn't pray to the statues. She sat by her single-burner hot plate and watched the blue flame. She felt a strange, quiet peace. She had survived the moral audit. She had the mercy bag tucked under her bed. She was still respectable in the eyes of the parish, but she was free in the eyes of herself. The church was a net that caught some and strangled others. Evelyn Thorne had learned how to swim through the mesh. As the decade drew to a close, the role of the church would begin to change as the war approached, but the scars of the judgmental overseer would remain. Evelyn walked to her window, looking out at the city of steeples. They were beautiful, yes, but they were cold. She closed her eyes, offering a silent, wordless prayer, not for a husband and not for a miracle, but for the strength to keep her own light burning in a room that the church would always consider empty. Harlem Nights and Southern Lights. By the year 1939, the Great Depression had been a cruel master to all, but for the single black woman in America, the struggle was not merely a battle against poverty, it was a war against a world that sought to make her invisible. In the North, there were the Harlem Nights, where the neon lights of the Savoy Ballroom masked the fact that many were living 10 to a room. In the South, there were the Southern Lights, the flickering lanterns of the tobacco fields and the back porch laundries. For Ruby, a woman who had migrated from the red clay of Georgia to the concrete pulse of New York, the 1930s were a masterclass in the double burden. She was black in a white-owned economy, and she was a woman in a man's world. To survive, Ruby had to be twice as fast, twice as clean, and 10 times as resilient. The ritual of the morning commute was where the segregation of the economy was most visible. Ruby lived in a cramped brownstone on 135th Street. Every morning at 5:00 a.m., she joined the Bronx Slave Market, a street corner where black women gathered to be inspected like cattle by white housewives looking for cheap day labor. "I don't care about your education, girl," a woman in a fur-trimmed coat snapped at Ruby. "Can you scrub a floor on your knees? Can you keep your mouth shut while my husband is home? I'm offering 15 cents an hour. Take it or get back on the train." Ruby took it. She had to. In 1939, a single black woman without a situation was a target for the police and the vagrancy laws. Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. This was the domestic frontier. While white business girls like Evelyn were typing in midtown offices, Ruby was the shadow in the kitchen. She was the one who raised the children of the wealthy while her own dreams were deferred. She was the one who bleached the linens of the people who wouldn't sit next to her on the bus. But Harlem at night was a different world. It was a sanctuary of jazz and resilience. After a 12-hour day of scrubbing, Ruby would return to the lights. Harlem was a city within a city. It was the rent party, an informal underground economy where neighbors would open their apartments, cook a pot of pig's feet and collard greens, and hire a piano player. They charged a nickel for entry to raise the money to keep the landlord from the door. "Don't let them see you tired, Ruby," whispered Hattie, a neighbor who had spent her youth in the cotton gins of the Carolinas. Hattie was the elder of the floor, a woman who knew the secret history of every woman in the building. If you show them your weariness, they think they've won. Put on that red lipstick. Straighten your stockings. We are the queens of the night, even if we're the mops of the day. Voice generator. Read the next part with a deep and rhythmic tone. The Southern Lights were never far from Ruby's mind. She sent half of her meager earnings back to Georgia every month, stuffed into envelopes with prayers for her mother's failing eyes. The letters from the South were a reminder of the Jim Crow reality she had fled. "The crops are dust," Ruby, her mother, wrote. "The men are gone to the CCC camps or the rails. The sheriff is looking for any reason to fill the chain gangs. Stay in the North, baby. Even if the cold bites, the leash is longer." But the leash in the North had its own teeth. The WPA programs that helped white women often had separate and unequal divisions for black workers. The alphabet soup was often watered down by the time it reached Harlem. Ruby saw the white girls getting the clerical jobs while she was directed toward the heavy-duty sewing rooms and the laundry vats. The sisterhood in Harlem was forged in the fire of this dual exclusion. They traded more than just bread, they traded dignity. Ruby and Hattie would spend their Saturday nights pressing and dressing. They would use a hot iron on their hair, the scent of burning oil and lavender filling the air. They were creating a version of themselves that the slave market could never touch. "They want us to be ghosts, Ruby," Hattie said, as she carefully mended a lace collar. "But a ghost can't dance the Lindy Hop. A ghost can't sing the blues so loud the stars shake. We are the visible women now." Pause for voice generator, 1 second. As the decade drew to its close, the Southern Lights and Harlem Nights began to merge into a new kind of political fire. Ruby began to attend meetings at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. She heard the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaigns. She saw the single women of Harlem standing on the front lines of the boycotts, their pocketbooks empty but their spirits overflowing. The struggle was unique because it was layered. It was the struggle for a nickel, it was the struggle for a seat, and it was the struggle for the right to be called Miss instead of girl. One evening, as the sun set over the Apollo Theater, Ruby stood on her fire escape. She looked down at the vibrant, chaotic beauty of the street. She heard the distant wail of a saxophone, a sound that was half sobbing and half soaring. "We are the backbone," she whispered to the city. "The world is resting on our shoulders, and they don't even know we are holding them up." Voice generator, read with a powerful and echoing tone. Ruby Thorne, for she had taken that name as a symbol of her own value, was no longer just a migrant from Georgia. She was a New Yorker. She was a survivor of the Great Depression. She was a woman who had navigated the slave market and the jazz clubs and had come out with her soul intact. The 1930s had tried to break her with hunger and with hate, but Ruby had found the lights. She had found the sisterhood of the brownstones and the strength of the southern soil. She turned back into her small, clean room and prepared her clothes for the morning. The floor would be hard tomorrow, the housewife would be cruel, but tonight she was the queen of Harlem, and the music was just beginning. The Union called. By the autumn of 1939, the wind blowing through the concrete canyons of the garment district carried a new electric charge. For years, the business girl had been told that her greatest assets were her silence, her speed, and her invisibility. But as the decade groaned toward its end, the quiet secretary was beginning to find her voice. For Evelyn, the transition from the sterile rows of typewriters to the chaotic heat of the picket line was not a choice, it was an awakening. The Great Depression had taken her savings and her security, but it had accidentally given her something far more dangerous to the status quo, a sense of collective power. The union call did not start with a shout, it started with a whisper behind a filing cabinet. "They're cutting the floor budget again, Evelyn," Martha whispered, her eyes darting toward the manager's glass-walled office. "They say the alphabet soup money is drying up. They want us to work an extra hour every night without a cent of overtime, and the elevator in the West Wing, it slipped again this morning." A girl from the billing department nearly lost her footing. Evelyn felt a familiar, cold knot of anger tighten in her chest. For years, she had polished her professional veneer, believing that if she worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, the system would protect her. But the system was a machine with a hungry mouth and no heart. "Silence is how they keep the floors unsafe, Martha," Evelyn replied, her fingers pausing over the keys of her underwood. "If we don't speak, we aren't employees, we're just disposable parts." Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The transformation of the single woman into a labor activist was a radical departure from the social norms of the 1930s. A woman on a picket line was seen as a troublemaker, a red, or worse, unladylike. But for the women of the secretarial pools and the textile floors, the union was the only family that actually looked out for them. The first meeting took place in the basement of a dim cafeteria. The room was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco and the nervous energy of 100 women who were risking everything for a nickel more an hour. "They call us bachelor girls to make us feel temporary," announced a woman from the ILGW, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She stood on a wooden crate, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "They think because we don't have husbands, we have no one to fight for us. But look around this room, we are each other's brothers, we are each other's strength. We don't want charity, we want a living wage." Voice generator, read with an inspirational and rising tone. Evelyn watched the faces in the room. She saw the seamstresses with their needle-scarred fingers. She saw the file clerks with their ink-stained blouses. She saw the sisters of the road who had finally found a place to stand still. For the first time, the sisterhood of the breadline was becoming a political force. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Instead of the usual click-clack of 50 typewriters, the office was met with a deafening, beautiful silence. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Henderson demanded, his face turning a panicked shade of crimson. "Get back to your stations. There are 1,000 girls on the street who would kill for these chairs." Evelyn stood up first. Her knees shook, but her voice was as steady as a ledger line. "Then let them take the chairs, Mr. Henderson, but they won't find anyone to run the machines until the floors are repaired and the wages are fair. We are stepping out." Walking out of the building was the most terrifying and liberating moment of Evelyn's life. She stepped onto the sidewalk and was greeted by a sea of placards and chanting. "Bread and roses," the women cried. It was a rhythmic, primal roar that drowned out the sound of the city traffic. The picket line was a masterclass in endurance. For 12 hours a day, Evelyn marched in a circle, the soles of her mended shoes thumping against the pavement. The moral code of the department store was gone. In its place was the union code. You didn't cross the line, you didn't let a sister march alone, and you never, ever gave up the line. "Look at them," Martha laughed, pointing at the police officers standing on the corner. "They don't know what to do with us. They're used to breaking up fights between men. They don't know how to handle 1,000 business girls who won't budge." Pause for voice generator, 1 second. But the union call had its casualties. The company brought in scabs, desperate women from the Hoovervilles who were forced to choose between their conscience and their hunger. Watching another single woman cross the line to take her job was a heartbreak that Evelyn hadn't prepared for. "Don't hate her, Evelyn," the union organizer said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The bosses didn't just build the factory, they built the hunger that feeds it. We are fighting so she won't have to make that choice tomorrow." The strike lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of no pay, 3 weeks of Mrs. Gable threatening eviction, 3 weeks of living on nothing but union soup and communal hope. Evelyn's professional veneer was completely gone now. Her face was windburned, her coat was tattered, but her eyes were filled with a terrifying new light. Voice generator, read the next part with a slow and victorious pace. On the 22nd day, the management broke. The contract was signed in a cramped lawyer's office. It wasn't everything they wanted, the raises were small and the hours were still long, but the safer floors were guaranteed, and more importantly, the quiet secretary was dead. Evelyn returned to her desk the next morning. The office looked the same dust motes dancing in the light, the same rows of black underwoods. But as she sat down, she didn't feel like a part in a machine. She felt like an architect. She looked at Martha, who was already typing away. They didn't need to speak. The union call had rewritten the terms of their existence. They were no longer just surviving the 1930s, they were defining the 1940s. As the sun set over the Hudson, casting long, golden shadows across her desk, Evelyn Thorne realized that the greatest safe floor wasn't made of wood or marble. It was made of the women standing next to her. The decade of the single woman was ending, but the era of the working woman had just begun. She reached for her ribbon and began to type. Click, clack, click, but this time the rhythm was her own. Radio waves and lonely rooms. By the winter of 1939, the silence of a single woman's room had become a physical presence, a heavy, cold shroud that settled in the corners and muffled the sound of the world outside. For Evelyn, the narrow walls of room 4C were no longer just a shelter. They were a sanctuary of solitude that could, on the wrong night, feel like a tomb. But sitting on her scarred wooden vanity was a miracle of walnut wood and glowing vacuum tubes, her Zenith long-distance radio. In the late 1930s, the radio was not a luxury. It was the invisible thread that stitched the lonely room back into the tapestry of the human race. It was the only voice that didn't ask for rent, the only guest that didn't require a meal. The ritual of the evening broadcast began the moment Evelyn returned from the office. The room would be freezing, the radiator giving its usual rhythmic metallic clank. She wouldn't take off her coat, she would head straight for the zenith. There was a specific, tactile magic in the clicking of the Bakelite knob, the soft, amber glow of the dial scale illuminating the dark room like a tiny, domestic sun. VRRR his static, the sound of the world tuning in, was a symphony of its own. Come on, old friend. Evelyn whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Tell me the world is still there. Suddenly, through the crackle of atmospheric interference and the ghosts of distant signals, the voice of the announcer would break through, clear, warm, and impossibly confident. Good evening, America. This is the NBC Red Network. Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. For the single woman, the radio was the ultimate social safety net for the spirit. While the bachelor girl's stigma kept her isolated from the dinner parties of the married elite, the radio invited her into the grandest ballrooms in the country. When the big bands of Benny Goodman or Glenn Miller played, Evelyn's room was no longer 8 feet wide. It was a cavernous dance hall. She would stand in her stockings, swaying to the rhythm of the saxophone, her shadow dancing against the yellowed wallpaper. Voice generator, read the next part with a dreamy and melancholic tone. But the radio was more than just music. It was a window into the grand escape. She followed the adventures of the Shadow and the domestic dramas of the Goldbergs. These voices became her family. She knew their troubles, their triumphs, and their catchphrases. In the crushing anonymity of the Great Depression, the radio gave her friends who never judged her frayed collar or her empty cupboards. I don't know what I'd do without the zenith, Martha, Evelyn said one evening as her neighbor huddled near the glowing tubes for warmth. When the announcer says, "Good night to you and yours," I pretend he's looking right at me. It makes the silence less deafening. It's a lie, Evelyn, Martha replied, though she didn't move away from the music. It's just copper wire and electricity. Maybe, Evelyn mused, but a beautiful lie is better than a cold truth. The radio was also the judgmental overseer of global reality. As the decade drew to a close, the radio waves began to carry a different kind of electricity. The music was increasingly interrupted by special bulletins. The frantic, staccato voice of H.V. Coltonborn or Edward R. Murrow would cut through the jazz, bringing news of Munich, of Poland, and of the gathering storm in Europe. The lonely room was no longer a fortress. The world was leaking in through the speakers. Evelyn found herself sitting by the radio for hours, her hand resting on the warm wood as if she were holding someone's hand. She heard the fireside chats of President Roosevelt, his voice a calm, fatherly anchor in a sea of uncertainty. When he spoke, he didn't speak to the masses. He spoke to her. He spoke to the woman in room 4C who was worried about her job, her rent, and the rumors of war. "I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking." Voice generator, read the FDR quote with a steady and reassuring cadence. This was the Zenith companion at its most vital. It turned the quiet secretary into a global citizen. It taught her that her lonely room was part of a front line. It provided a sense of belonging that the church, the department store, and the boarding house had all failed to give. In the darkness of 1939, the radio was the great leveler. The rich man in his mansion and the single woman in her kitchenette were listening to the same signal, at the same time, feeling the same shiver of history. One night the signal was particularly weak. The static was a roar, like a distant ocean trying to drown out the music. Evelyn adjusted the wire antenna she had strung across the ceiling, her fingers trembling. "Don't leave me," she whispered to the box. "Not tonight." Then out of the grey noise, a solo violin began to play. It was a slow, haunting melody that seemed to capture the entire grief of the decade. Evelyn sat on the floor, her back against the radiator, and wept. She wasn't weeping for her hunger or her loneliness. She was weeping for the beauty of the human voice that could travel through the air, through the walls, and through the fear to find her. Pause for voice generator, 1 second. The radio waves had saved her. They had kept her mind sharp when the work was dull. They had kept her heart open when the world was cold. The Zenith was the witness to her survival. As the sun began to rise, the radio gave one final, soft hum before the station went off the air. Evelyn turned the knob to off. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't a shroud, it was a space waiting to be filled. She stood up, straightened her starched collar, and prepared for another day. The lonely room was quiet, but the music of the world was still vibrating in her bones. The shadow of global storms. By the autumn of 1939, the Great Depression began to change its face. The monster that had lived in the stomach, the gnawing hunger and the empty pockets, was being replaced by a monster that lived in the mind. For Evelyn, the daily struggle to find a nickel for coffee was suddenly eclipsed by the terrifying headlines screaming from the newsstands. The domestic survival of the last decade was merging into something much larger, darker, and more industrial. The world was no longer just poor, it was preparing. The shift was visible in the very fabric of the city. The breadlines hadn't vanished, but the men standing in them were looking at the sky more often than the pavement. "Have you seen the papers today, Evelyn?" Martha asked, her voice trembling as she folded a copy of the New York Post. "The Germans are in Poland. The British have declared war. It feels like the air is getting thinner, like the whole world is holding its breath." "The air isn't thinner, Martha," Evelyn replied, staring out the window of their boarding house at the distant, flickering lights of the harbor. "It's thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning oil. We spent 10 years trying to stay alive, and now they want us to learn how to die." Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The jitters were not just a feeling, they were an economic shift. Suddenly, the WPA and alphabet soup programs began to pivot. The sewing rooms that had been making floral flower sack dresses were now being contracted to make thousands of olive drab blankets and heavy canvas tents. The clerical pools were no longer indexing old library books. They were beginning to track industrial capacity and manpower reserves. For the single woman, this shift brought a strange, conflicting sense of hope and horror. For the first time in 10 years, there were jobs. The factories that had been silent for a decade were beginning to hum with the pre-war effort. But the price of this new prosperity was the shadow of the draft and the fear of a global storm. They're calling it the defense effort, Beatrice said during a Sunday dinner that felt more like a council of war. My brother says the shipyards in Brooklyn are hiring 3 shifts a day. He says they don't even care if you've got a union card anymore. They just want hands. Voice generator, read the next part with a tense and packing tone. The social life of the bachelor girl changed almost overnight. The dances at the local halls were no longer filled with weary men in frayed suits. They were filled with young men in uniform, men who were suddenly precious because their time was short. The desperation of the depression was being replaced by the desperation of the goodbye. Evelyn watched as the younger girls in the boarding house fell into war romances, marrying boys they had known for 3 weeks before they were shipped off to training camps in the South. The stigma of the old maid was fading, but in its place was the anxiety of the waiting woman. Why don't you go with that sergeant from the USO dance, Evelyn? Martha teased, though her eyes were sad. He's got a steady paycheck and a pension. It's better than waiting for the next crash. I've spent 10 years learning how to stand on my own 2 feet, Martha, Evelyn said, her voice like iron. I'm not going to lean on a man just because the world is catching fire. If a storm is coming, I want to be the one steering my own boat. The shadow reached its peak in the winter of 1939. The radio, her faithful Zenith companion, was no longer a source of escape. The silver screen was no longer just about Ginger Rogers. It was preceded by newsreels of burning cities and marching boots. The one-pot meal was now complicated by the first whispers of rationing. Evelyn found herself walking through Times Square, looking at the massive electric tickers. The news wasn't about the price of wheat or the bank closures anymore. It was about battleships, Lend-Lease, and the Atlantic. The Great Depression was ending, but the good times hadn't arrived. Instead, the country was transitioning from a hospital ward to an armory. One evening, a blackout drill was called. For 15 minutes, the city that never sleeps was plunged into total, absolute darkness. Evelyn sat in her room, the zenith silent, the only light coming from the moon hitting the air shaft. In that silence, she realized that her life as a 1930s single woman was over. The skills she had learned, the frugality, the resilience, the sisterhood, and the union call were the very things that would make her indispensable in the decade to come. Pause for voice generator, 1 second. We survived the hunger, she whispered into the dark. We can survive the fire. The global storm was no longer a jitter on the horizon. It was a thunderclap at the door. As the sirens wailed to signal the end of the drill, Evelyn Thorne stood up. She didn't look for a man to protect her. She reached for her heavy work coat. She looked at her hands, hands that had typed 1 million words, mended 1,000 seams, and carried 100 loads of coal. She was ready. The 1930s had forged her into a weapon of endurance. And as the world turned toward the 1940s, the quiet secretary was about to become the engine of victory. Architects of modernity. By the dawn of 1940, the long, grey winter of the Great Depression was finally breaking. But it was not disappearing, it was being transformed. For 10 years, the single woman of America had lived in the shadows, dismissed as surplus, labeled as old maids, and pushed to the back of every breadline. But as the engines of industry began to roar with the demand of a world at war, a startling truth emerged. The bachelor girl was not a burden. She was the architect of the new world. Evelyn Thorne stood on the platform of the 42nd Street subway station, but she was no longer clutching a nickel for coffee with a trembling hand. She was carrying a leather briefcase, and her stride was the rhythmic, confident pace of a woman who had been through the fire and found she was made of steel. The workforce boom of the 1940s did not happen by accident. It was built on the calloused hands and sharpened minds of the women who had made do since 1929. Look at the posters, Evelyn, Martha said, pointing to a new government advertisement on the station wall. It featured a woman with her sleeves rolled up, her hair tucked under a bandana, and a rivet gun in her hand. They're calling us Rosies now. They want us in the shipyards. They want us in the aircraft plants. Suddenly, they've forgotten all about our proper place in the kitchen. They didn't forget, Martha, Evelyn replied, her voice echoing with a decade of wisdom. They just realized that we've been Rosie for 10 years. We were Rosies when we mended our own shoes. We were Rosies when we ran the Union picket lines. And we were Rosies when we cooked for 20 on a single-burner hot plate. The world is just finally catching up to us. Pause for voice generator, 1.5 seconds. The 1930s had been a brutal training ground. The business girl of the Depression had learned how to manage impossible budgets. She had learned the discipline of the alphabet soup agencies, and she had mastered the art of professional invisibility. When the men were called to the front, these single women stepped into the vacant roles not as amateurs, but as seasoned veterans of survival. Evelyn was promoted to a senior administrative role in a defense logistics firm. She was no longer just a quiet secretary. She was managing a floor of 60 workers. She was coordinating shipments that spanned the Atlantic. She was an architect of the supply chain. This was the legacy of the lone woman. The survival of the 1930s had dismantled the myth that women were fragile or temporary. The single woman, once pitied for her lack of a husband, was now envied for her autonomy. She had her own bank account, she had her own apartment, and most importantly, she had the memory of her own resilience. The social safety nets they had built in the boarding houses, the sisterhood of the breadline, became the blueprint for the wartime childcare centers and communal living arrangements of the 1940s. The underground economy of skills and trades became the foundation of the wartime labor unions. "We are the bridge, Evelyn," Beatrice said, now a supervisor at a munitions factory in New Jersey. "We are the bridge between the world that broke and the world that's being born. Our struggle wasn't just about bread, it was about precedent." Voice generator, read the next part with a profound and rising tone. The stigma of the spinster died in the factories of 1942. The woman who lived alone was no longer a failed wife, she was a patriot. But Evelyn knew the truth was deeper than patriotism. It was about the sovereignty of the self. The 1930s had taught her that a woman could lose her job, her savings, and her social standing, and still be whole. As the war progressed, the single women of the 30s became the mentors for the younger generation. They taught the new girls how to handle a floorwalker's gaze, how to stretch a ration book, and how to keep their dignity when the world was in chaos. They were the architects of modernity because they had already survived the end of the world once before. One evening, Evelyn returned to her old boarding house on 22nd Street. She was moving into her own sun-drenched apartment in a building that didn't have a ladies-only sign on the door. She stood in room 4C for the last time. The yellowed wallpaper was still there. The radiator still gave its pathetic, metallic wheeze. She looked at the spot on the vanity where her Zenith radio had once sat, the radio that had been her only friend during the lonely rooms of 1939. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for the cold. Thank you for the hunger. You made me unbreakable." Pause for voice generator, 1 second. The 1930s had ended, but the unbound year would live forever in the way Evelyn walked, the way she worked, and the way she refused to ever be invisible again. The single women of America had not just survived the Great Depression, they had conquered it. They had laid the groundwork for a future where a woman's worth was determined by her own hand and her own heart. Evelyn Thorne walked out of the boarding house and into the bustling, neon-lit street of 1945. The war was ending, the world was changing, but Evelyn was ready. She was no longer a shadow in the breadline. She was the master of her own destiny. The echo of the crash had finally faded, replaced by the steady, powerful heartbeat of a woman who knew exactly who she was. She looked up at the Manhattan skyline, the jagged, beautiful teeth of a city she had tamed. She smiled, she straightened her collar, and she walked into the light.